A man hears scratching at his door. He thinks it's the wind. But when he opens it, a frozen German shepherd collapses at his feet. He saves the dog, but the next night, a second dog appears, and then the truth starts unraveling. What were these dogs running from? Who were they trained to obey? And who left them to die? Keep watching, because this isn't just a rescue story. It's a battle between cruelty and compassion, and it starts with one man and a knock in the snow. Watch till the end. This will change the way you see loyalty. Chapter 1, The Knock Beneath the Storm. The wind was howling through Briar Hill that night like a pack of wild hounds, flinging snow against windows and rattling everything not bolted down. It was the kind of storm that made even the bravest stay indoors, and the lonely feel even more forgotten. Inside a modest Victorian home on the edge of Broadmoor Street, Carter Hale sat in the dim amber light of his living room, one hand wrapped around a chipped porcelain mug of black tea gone cold. He hadn't taken a sip in half an hour. The fire in the gas heater flickered gently, casting tall shadows that danced along the walls, across the worn oil paintings and half-finished canvases that leaned forgotten in corners. Carter, 47, was once the city's most talked-about painter, his work displayed in galleries from Portland to Denver. But that was before grief hollowed him out. He had the rugged build of a man who once enjoyed life in the outdoors, now softened by solitude. His once thick dark hair had turned mostly silver, and his beard, patchy but clean, added a kind of resigned wisdom to his strong jawline. His eyes, a tired but piercing green, often stared into nothing, as if he were still waiting for someone to return. Ever since the accident took Claire, his wife, his muse, 3 winters ago, Carter had slowly withdrawn, painting less, speaking less, and eventually moving to this quiet neighborhood in Briar Hill, where no one asked questions and time passed softly, like snow settling on old steps. The radio crackled from the kitchen, its sound low but present. You're listening to Voices of Briar Hill. This is Dr. Evelyn Maynard with your weekly cold pause alert. A crisp, clear female voice announced. Tonight's temperature is expected to drop below -10, so please check your yards, porches, garages, any place where a stray animal might be seeking shelter. If you spot any abandoned dogs, call the shelter emergency line. Remember, one blanket can mean the difference between life and death. Then came a pause and a softer tone. Kindness doesn't cost much, but it buys time. Time they need to survive the night. Carter didn't know Evelyn personally, but he'd heard her name more than once. She was in her early 50s, originally from Yorkshire, and had worked with military service animals before settling in Oregon. There were rumors about her, a failed engagement, a breakdown during a deployment overseas, but what people remembered most was her voice on the radio, a voice that sounded like it could convince anyone to care. The mug in Carter's hand trembled slightly as he leaned back in his chair. Outside, the storm intensified. Then, he heard it. A sound. A faint, irregular scratching. He stiffened. For a moment he thought it was just the wind playing its tricks, or maybe a tree branch brushing the side of the house. But then it came again. Closer, clearer. Scratch, scratch, whine. Setting the mug aside, Carter rose slowly. The floorboards creaked beneath his slippers as he crossed to the front hallway. The storm outside screamed against the glass panels. He hesitated, then unlocked the door and opened it just a crack. The wind bit at his face instantly, sharp as broken glass. Snowflakes tore through the gap and landed on the floor. He raised one arm to shield his eyes and peered through the blur. There, at the edge of the stoop, collapsed in a heap of ice and fur, was a dog. A German shepherd. Its fur was soaked, clumped with frost and dirt. The animal's ribs showed beneath the matted coat, and one of its ears hung limp, as if frozen into that shape. Its eyes, deep, amber, and dazed, met Carter's for one long second before the dog let out a weak whine and tried to drag itself forward, collapsing halfway. "Jesus Christ," Carter breathed. He flung the door wide, stepped out, and bent down, ignoring the sting of wind against his face. The dog was heavy, but not impossibly so. Carter wrapped his arms around its torso, careful not to press too hard against the ribs, and brought it inside, kicking the door shut behind him. "Easy, boy, easy." He laid the shepherd gently on a wool rug near the gas heater, then ran to grab an old blanket from the linen closet. He returned to find the dog's breathing shallow, ragged. The body was ice cold. Carter wrapped the blanket around him, then fetched a towel and began gently rubbing the damp fur, trying to restore some warmth. Minutes passed like hours. The dog remained still until Carter, barely daring to breathe, saw one ear twitch. Then the tail moved. Then the eyes flickered. "You're not giving up on me," Carter whispered. "Not tonight." Far across town, in the brightly lit newsroom of Briar Hill Public Access TV, Finn Delaney tapped at a half-broken keyboard with the energy of a man who still believed he could change the world, even if no one else did. At 24, Finn looked perpetually windswept, ginger hair always messy, freckles dotting his pale cheeks like a constellation. He wore the same olive green canvas jacket every day, and a backpack stuffed with camera gear and trail mix followed him everywhere. Tonight, however, Finn wasn't chasing headlines. He was editing footage for a puff piece about Briar Hill's annual pie baking contest. He sighed, glanced at his notepad, and flipped to a blank page. At the top, he scribbled in capital letters, "Missing dogs, find the real story." He didn't know where to begin, but something had been bothering him for days. A growing number of local pet disappearance reports, vague leads, and now rumors of a white van circling neighborhoods after dark. "Delaney!" barked his editor, a jaded man named Kurt with the eyes of a hawk and the heart of a banker. "You're not here to play detective. Stick to pie stories. People like pie." But Finn wasn't listening. He'd already packed his camera. Back at Carter's home, the storm howled louder still. But inside, the light glowed warmer. Carter had boiled a bit of broth and placed the bowl near the dog's nose. The shepherd sniffed once, twice, then slowly began to lap at it. Carter felt a surprising swell of relief in his chest. Something like pride, something dangerously close to hope. "I guess we're both strays now," he said softly, stroking the dog's neck. He didn't know yet that the storm hadn't just brought him a dog. It had brought a secret, a story, and perhaps a second chance. Outside, the snow buried everything in sight. But on Carter Hale's doorstep, something had survived the night. Something was just beginning. The morning after the storm broke with a silence so heavy, it felt almost reverent. The world outside Carter Hale's windows was encased in frost, rooftops glistening like sugar-coated gingerbread, tree branches weighed down by fresh snow. The city of Briar Hill had entered its annual deep freeze. But inside Carter's Victorian house, something had thawed. A quiet companionship was forming, tentative but real. The German shepherd lay curled near the heater, his breathing steadier now, his body wrapped in a thick fleece blanket. Carter sat cross-legged on the floor a few feet away, a cup of lukewarm coffee in his hand, watching the dog with wary eyes. "Sable," he said aloud, testing the name. "Yeah, you look like a sable." The dog didn't react at first, but after a few seconds, his ears twitched. He shifted slightly, enough to meet Carter's gaze. Those amber eyes were clearer now, less glazed with frostbite and exhaustion. Carter offered a small smile. "We'll get you back on your feet, buddy." He didn't tell Sable that he hadn't named anything in years. Not a painting, not a plant, not even the birds nesting on his porch. The name came unbidden, almost instinctual, as if the dog had been waiting for it all along. Later that morning, after Sable had dozed off again, Carter bundled up and headed outside to shovel the front walk. The snow had crusted over in the night and broke under his boots with a satisfying crunch. As he worked, a city plow rumbled down the street, its horn blaring briefly to signal a turn. The noise echoed off the narrow brick walls of the neighborhood, and from inside the house, Carter heard it. A thud, then a bark, then a frantic, terrified growl. He dropped the shovel and sprinted back inside. Sable was no longer by the heater. The dog had backed himself into a corner near the hallway, his legs splayed, tail tucked, eyes wild. He was growling low, his entire body taut like a drawn bowstring. Carter froze, arms slightly raised. "Sable," he said gently, "it's okay. It was just the plow." The dog didn't move. His eyes darted, teeth bared now. His ears were pinned back and his chest heaved as if he'd been running. The sound of the horn, something about it had triggered something deep, something feral. Carter slowly knelt down, voice soft. "You're safe now. No one's gonna hurt you." He kept talking, calmly, slowly, until finally Sable's body relaxed by a fraction. Enough to blink. Enough to breathe. That's when Carter saw it. Along Sable's right hind leg, beneath the dirt-stained fur, was a faint but unmistakable scar, a long, curved line like a rope burn. It wasn't fresh, but it was deep, and it wasn't the only one. As he looked closer, Carter noticed more, lines across the shoulders, the side of the neck. Faint but visible. Faint but damning. He sat down against the wall and exhaled. "What happened to you?" Across town, at the Briar Hill Animal Wellness Center, Dr. Evelyn Maynard adjusted her wool scarf and pulled on her gloves as she stepped out into the biting wind. She had just ended her morning segment on the community radio, a brief 5-minute update about the Cold Paws campaign, and was checking her messages on the way to her truck. Evelyn was in her early 50s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that felt equal parts maternal and military. Her hair, once auburn, was now mostly silver and always tied into a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes, gray and shrewd, missed little. She wore an old Army-issued coat patched at the elbows and walked like someone who knew what to do in a crisis. She had seen war zones. She had patched up dogs in combat zones and comforted soldiers in worse shape than their canines. Today, a voicemail caught her attention. "Hi, I'm not sure if this is the right place, but I live near the industrial yard on Ashby Street, and there's this dog, big, tan-colored, tied up behind one of the old shipping containers. Looks real scared. I tried to approach, but it growled. Figured someone should know." Evelyn's fingers tightened around her phone. Ashby Street was an old trucking district, nearly abandoned. It wasn't the first time someone had reported animals from that area. Back at the Briar Hill news studio, Finn Delaney slumped in the editing suite, his headphones crooked over one ear, dark circles under his eyes. He'd spent the better part of the night sorting through raw footage for the community updates. Tree falls, school closures, roadblocks. He'd also reviewed his own footage from the day before. It was grainy, taken from across the street with no zoom, but it was clear enough. A gray delivery van, rust-streaked and windowless, turning into a fenced-off lot in the outskirts of the old quarter. And just before the clip ended, a yelp. Quick, sharp, heartbreaking. Finn had captured it by accident while filming background shots for a segment on winter cleanup crews, but that sound had stayed with him. He played the clip again. This time he paused just before the van disappeared behind the chain-link gate. There, barely visible, was a movement. A tail, a muzzle, he couldn't tell. But it wasn't garbage or machinery. It was alive, and it had been trying to get out. His editor had already told him not to chase dog stories, not when there were potholes to be reported and pie contests to be covered. But Finn had a gut feeling. And gut feelings to him were as good as leads. Back in Carter's home, the sun had reached its noon peak, though it gave off more light than warmth. Carter sat beside Sable, brushing through the shepherd's fur gently with an old comb. He spoke occasionally, not expecting answers. "I think you've seen some bad people, huh?" he murmured. "But you're here now, and no one's ever putting a leash on you again unless you ask for it." Sable didn't flinch this time when a car alarm sounded down the street. He only looked toward the window, then back at Carter, and laid his head down on the blanket. That night, Carter wrote in a journal he hadn't touched in years. He reacts to sounds like he's been trained, or worse. There are scars, more than I want to think about. But when I look in his eyes, I don't see aggression. I see memory. I think he remembers too much. Outside, the snow glistened. Somewhere, a gray van rumbled along a forgotten street, and somewhere else, a phone buzzed in Evelyn Maynard's pocket as she pulled up a city map marking Ashby Street with a red X. Tomorrow, she'd start asking questions, and someone, somewhere, would not want her to. The third night after the storm fell quiet. Snow had stopped falling, but the temperature had dipped even lower, turning Briar Hill's streets into frozen veins of silence. The neighborhood where Carter Hale lived had become a ghostly still life. Street lamps glowing in soft halos, icicles clinging to gutters like sharpened teardrops, and no sound except for the creak of cold metal and the occasional bark echoing from far-off yards. Inside his home, Carter dozed lightly on the living room couch, a wool blanket draped over his legs, a book resting open across his chest. The fire was low, and the only light came from the soft blue glow of the lamp beside Sable's bed. The shepherd had been calm all evening, watchful but not tense. Then, just past midnight, Sable sprang up. It was instant. Not a twitch, not a restless dream, but a jolt. He bolted upright, Ears pricked, nostrils flaring, Carter stirred at the sudden motion and rubbed his eyes groggily. "What is it?" he asked, sitting up. Sable let out a sharp, clipped bark, an alert, not a warning, and trotted to the door. He turned and looked back at Carter, pawing once at the floor. Another bark. Urgent now. Still bleary, Carter pulled on his coat, shoved his feet into boots, and unlocked the front door. The cold slammed into him like a wave of needles. "You better not be chasing raccoons," he muttered. But Sable wasn't chasing anything. He took 3 steps outside and stopped. His nose twitched in the air, then he darted across the icy porch and down the steps, heading toward the edge of the property. Carter followed, his breath fogging the air. Then he heard it, a sound that wasn't the wind, a whimper, faint and high-pitched, barely audible above the soft crackle of ice beneath his boots. They rounded the side of the house, and there it was. Curled beneath a frozen bush, barely more than a bundle of frost-covered fur, was a puppy. A German shepherd pup, no more than 6 months old, ribs visible, paws trembling violently. Its eyes were dull, frightened. One leg was bent at a strange angle, and its breathing came in shallow, rapid pants. Carter knelt down, heart sinking. "God, oh, you poor thing." Sable approached slowly, and to Carter's surprise, the pup didn't retreat. Instead, it gave a weak wag of its tail and tried to lift its head. The older shepherd whined low in his throat and nudged the puppy gently with his nose. Carter stood up and gently lifted the pup into his arms. The weight was shockingly light. Sable walked beside him the whole way back, his body pressed against Carter's leg as if guiding him home. Back inside, the familiar rhythm resumed. The heater turned up, blankets spread, towels warmed in the dryer. Carter worked quickly but carefully, drying the pup, wrapping it tight, preparing broth the same way he had for Sable. This pup's coat was darker, more sable gray with faint russet accents near its paws. One ear flopped forward, the other half folded back. It was filthy, starved, but its eyes, those eyes had life. Sable stayed close, never looking away. When the puppy finally managed to lap a few drops of warm broth, Sable let out a soft huff and lay down, head close to the pup's flank. Carter watched the interaction, something tightening in his chest. "You know each other, don't you?" he whispered. Morning brought a knock at the door. Not a metaphorical one, an actual knock. Firm, deliberate. Carter opened the door cautiously to find a tall woman in a navy winter coat, clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into a practical bun, and her steel-gray eyes scanned Carter like she was assessing a battlefield. "Mr. Hale?" she asked. "Yes?" "Dr. Evelyn Maynard," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I received a call from a neighbor about a German shepherd spotted in this area during the storm. I'm coordinating the Cold Paws Rescue Initiative. Mind if I come in?" Carter stepped aside wordlessly. Inside, Evelyn crouched beside the 2 dogs, her eyes narrowing with focus. "They're bonded," she murmured, "likely from the same holding group." "Holding group?" Carter asked. Evelyn nodded. "These aren't just strays. Look at the posture, the muscle wear, controlled socialization behavior. These dogs were trained, but discarded." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small scanning device. With a few slow movements, she hovered it over Sable's left shoulder. A beep, but the screen blinked red. "Tampered chip," she said grimly. "Common with dogs from underground K9 programs. Someone tried to wipe the ID." She moved to the pup. Another scan. No chip detected. "I can run a deeper scan at the center," Evelyn said. "And I'd like to take blood samples, if you're comfortable with that. These dogs could be evidence in a much larger case." "They're not going anywhere," Carter said, firmer than he expected. Evelyn studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Fair enough. I'll do what I can here." Later that day, in a small corner office at Briar Hill Public Access News, Finn Delaney presented his phone to Kurt, the station's gruff managing editor. "I have something," he said. "A van, gray, no windows. I caught it on camera in Old Town, and I swear there was a dog in the back." Kurt barely looked up. "Finn, people are freezing out there. Roads are closed. We need real coverage, not mystery vans and animal drama." "This is real," Finn insisted. "I think someone's dumping trained dogs. I don't know if it's a training facility gone dark or—" "Get me footage of a pothole swallowing a car," Kurt interrupted. "Then we'll talk." That night, Finn packed his camera and left through the back exit, phone still buzzing in his coat pocket. He wasn't going to wait for permission. Back in Carter's house, the puppy finally slept. Curled into Sable's side, the smaller dog let out a sigh that sounded almost human. Carter stood over them quietly, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. He didn't know what he was caught up in, but something inside him had shifted. The house felt full for the first time in years, not loud, not crowded, but full of breathing, of warmth, of presence. He found himself whispering names, trying them on like old shoes. Scout? Bandit? Lark? The pup's tail twitched. Carter smiled. Lark it is. As he turned off the lights and let the house fall into night, he couldn't help but glance once more at Sable. The older dog was awake, eyes open, watching Carter. Not afraid, not confused, just aware. And in those eyes, Carter saw it. Not just memory, but recognition. Whatever world Sable had come from, it had followed him here, and brought someone with it. The sun had only just begun to rise, casting a faint orange smear across the icy rooftops of Briar Hill, when Carter Hale stepped outside with Sable trailing close behind. The snow in the front yard, once pristine, had become a canvas of paw prints and human boot marks. The puppy, Lark, was still asleep inside, curled against a pile of blankets beside the heater, but Sable was alert. His ears perked, nose twitching toward the edge of the yard. Carter squinted into the white. There were new tracks in the snow, ones he hadn't made, ones too deep to belong to a child. He crouched, pressing a gloved hand beside them for comparison. The boots were large, heavy, likely worn by a man. They had entered the side of his property sometime in the night, curved toward the porch, then stopped. He turned his head. No return trail. Someone had come to his home. Someone hadn't left. His pulse quickened. Sable growled low in his throat, staring toward the back alley that separated his property from a neglected patch of woodland bordering the neighborhood. Carter rose, brushing snow from his knees. "Come on," he whispered to the dog. "Let's see where they go." Behind the neighborhood, the ground dipped into a shallow ravine, flanked by scraggly trees and rusting chain-link fences. Briar Hill had pockets like this, leftover industrial corners from when the city had thrived decades ago. Now, they were the kind of places forgotten by zoning maps, but remembered by anyone trying to disappear. Sable moved ahead of him, his nose buried in the trail. They passed a collapsed fence post, ducked under a skeletal oak tree, and reached a clearing pockmarked with tire grooves. On the far end of the lot stood a row of derelict shipping containers, stacked like mismatched bricks. One had its door slightly ajar, revealing a pile of soaked cardboard and what looked like frayed rope. Carter didn't go closer. He had the overwhelming sense that someone, or something, was watching him. He turned to Sable. The dog stood frozen, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the tree line. The wind picked up. Back at the Briar Hill Animal Wellness Center, Dr. Evelyn Maynard was already 2 cups deep into her morning black tea. Sleeves rolled above her elbows as she typed up a report. Her office was cluttered but precise. Shelves lined with veterinary texts, charts pinned to the walls, and a dozen photos of dogs adopted out of difficult circumstances. The photo at the center of her corkboard was of a black Labrador named Daisy, wearing a purple vest marked Therapy Certified. Evelyn's hand paused briefly near the photo before she reached for the phone. The screen read, "Ron Vega." She answered, "Morning, Ron." "I got your message," came the gruff voice on the other end. "3 dogs? Gone from the Pine Grove Center?" "Yes." All 3 were registered therapy dogs, assigned to different care homes, vanished within a week of each other. Same region. No forced entry. No surveillance picked them up. Ron Vega was a detective in his early 50s, tall and wiry, with prematurely white hair and a nose slightly crooked from an old boxing injury. Originally from Glasgow, he had the sharp edge of someone who never quite relaxed, and he didn't waste words. After retiring from Interpol's division on trafficking cases, he had moved to Oregon hoping for peace. Instead, he'd found new kinds of crime. Quieter, but no less sinister. Ron clicked his pen on the other end. "Let's assume it's not coincidence." "I already am," Evelyn said. "And I have a new case, Sable, scarred, behaviorally trained, and dumped in a snowstorm." Then a puppy showed up 2 days later, same breed, possibly bonded. Ron was silent for a beat, You think someone's disposing of K9 trained animals? I think someone's using them until they're not profitable. Send me what you've got. Meanwhile, in a small local cafe called the Honey Spoon, Finn Delaney warmed his hands around a mug of cocoa, waiting. He looked slightly out of place, too young, too restless, with messy ginger hair that refused to stay under his beanie and a parka patched at the elbows. His camera bag sat under the table, the zipper slightly open. Across from him sat a boy, Elliot Rowan, thin, pale, around 12, with a narrow face framed by an oversized hoodie. His sneakers barely reached the floor, and his hands fidgeted with the sugar packets on the table. Elliot was Carter's neighbor, a sharp-eyed kid who'd once been described by a teacher as alarmingly observant. "You said you saw something?" Finn prompted gently. Elliot nodded, eyes darting toward the window. A van, big and gray, no windows. It came around a few nights before the storm. He paused. It stopped in front of that abandoned lot on Ashby Street. "The one near the warehouses?" "Yeah, a man got out. He had something like a leash. And I heard barking, angry barking, scared barking." "Did you see any dogs?" "Not clearly, just shadows." Finn leaned forward. "Did you tell anyone?" "My mom. She said not to get involved, but then—" Elliot hesitated. "Then I saw one of the dogs, on Mr. Hale's porch, the one with the yellow eyes." Finn's heart skipped. "You're sure?" Elliot nodded. After parting ways with the boy, Finn didn't return to the studio. Instead, he walked the 3 blocks to Ashby Street. He passed frost-covered dumpsters, graffiti-tagged walls, and finally reached the lot. He found boot prints in the snow, large, fresh. The tracks led toward a rusted chain-link gate hanging slightly ajar. Through it, he could see the faint outline of shipping containers. Something deep in his gut twisted. That night, Carter sat beside the fireplace. Lark nestled in his lap, Sable at his feet. He kept glancing toward the window, drawn to the shadowed stillness outside. He had cleaned the pup's wounds earlier, small cuts along the belly, possibly from barbed wire. Sable hadn't left her side since they brought her in. Lark had a softness to her despite the fear in her eyes. Her paws were dainty, but her build hinted at strength to come. She was no stray by accident. She had been trained. He could see it in the way she responded to subtle motion, how she flinched not from noise but from human hands. Carter closed his journal and stood. He walked to the door, opened it, and stared out across the yard, toward the trees and the old fence line. The snow had mostly covered the footprints from earlier, but he knew they had been there. Someone had come. Someone had stood there, watching. And if Carter had learned anything in the last few days, it was that Sable had not come alone. He had been followed. The wind had changed. It blew colder now, not with the blunt force of a snowstorm, but with the creeping stillness of something hiding just out of sight. Carter Hale stood at the edge of Ashby Street, hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat, eyes scanning the rust-streaked shipping containers across the lot. Sable sat beside him, ears alert, nostrils flaring toward the bitter scent that drifted on the wind. Metal, mold, and something older. Carter had seen enough in Sable's body language these past days to know when the dog was remembering. There were no children playing in this part of town. No cars rolled by. The buildings that once thrummed with factory work now sagged with age, paint peeled from bricks like old scabs. One of the containers near the far corner stood slightly ajar. That was the one Sable kept watching. Carter moved slowly, boots crunching over frozen slush and gravel. The padlock on the container's latch hung broken. Sable didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stepped ahead, as if he already knew what lay inside. The container opened with a groan. The stench hit Carter first. Old urine, rot, the sourness of wet fabric left too long to fester. Inside, the steel walls had rusted from the floor up. Makeshift kennels constructed from bent fencing wire lined the interior. Some held remnants of bedding. Shredded blankets, gnawed bones, plastic bowls stained and cracked. Chains bolted to corners told a clearer story than any sign could. These weren't temporary shelters. They were cages. Carter swallowed, heart racing. He didn't speak. Sable walked in behind him, nose brushing the cold floor, pausing at one of the larger kennels. There, claw marks scraped deep into the metal paneling. Long, violent, desperate. Near the far wall, half covered by a mildewed tarp, Carter found something else, a binder. Its corners were curled and damp, but the inside pages had been sealed in plastic. Neat handwriting labeled each sheet, rows of names, breeds, temperament ratings, training stages, and something that made Carter's stomach twist. Projected resale value. Subject 12, German Shepherd. Obedient, high response, bite trained, $1,600. Subject 17, Belgian Malinois, nervous under pressure, $800. Subject 22, Shepherd Mix, incomplete recall, discarded. He didn't need to read further. Carter stood frozen, binder in hand, until a sudden bark from Sable jolted him back. The shepherd had moved to the entrance, body stiff, ears forward. Someone was out there. Carter killed his flashlight and crouched low. For a moment, silence. Then, a shuffle of gravel. Quick, heavy, retreating. But not fast enough. Across the street, hidden behind the warped fencing, someone else was watching and recording. Finn Delaney gripped his handheld camera tighter as he zoomed in. He had followed Carter from a distance, keeping to the shadows, not intending to interfere. But as soon as he saw the container's door open, he'd known he was in the right place. He crouched near the wall of a neighboring garage, adjusting the lens for low light. He captured everything. Carter's reaction, the interior, the binder, then movement. Behind the containers, a tall figure stepped into view. Dressed in black, head covered, hands gloved. Finn zoomed in, breath caught in his throat. The figure held something? A crowbar? No, a pipe. Finn stepped back instinctively, and his foot struck a metal canister. The clang echoed like thunder. The figure turned. For one tense heartbeat, they stared at each other. Then the figure charged. Finn scrambled to his feet and ran. He sprinted across the lot, heart hammering, camera tucked to his chest. Behind him, footsteps closed in. He vaulted a broken fence, ducked through a side alley, and made it 2 blocks before daring to look back. No one followed. He leaned against a street lamp, panting. Only then did he realize his camera screen was cracked, smashed on the left side. The display was gone. But the memory card was still in his pocket. Back at the Briar Hill precinct, Detective Ron Vega sat in his cluttered office, surrounded by case files, reports, and cold coffee. The storm outside had locked the city in ice, but it was the string of missing animal cases that kept him cold. He flipped through the most recent file Evelyn had emailed, photos of Sable's scars, notes on his behavioral triggers, and, most importantly, images of the binder Carter had just delivered to the station. Ron studied the handwriting carefully. Angular strokes, right-leaning, consistent pressure. He opened another folder, this one older, labeled Burke Silas Burke, a name that still made his jaw tighten. Once a certified handler for K9 security firms in Montana, Burke had lost his license after reports surfaced of illegal off-site training facilities. Unregulated, underground, brutal. But no bodies. No physical evidence. The case had collapsed. He'd vanished not long after. Ron compared the writing samples. It wasn't perfect. But the loop on the G's, the trailing tails of the Y's, it was enough. He picked up his phone and called Evelyn. "I think your dog whisperer was right. And Carter Hale just handed me the evidence we needed 3 years ago." In his home, Carter paced the living room, the binder locked in a drawer. Lark lay asleep on her side, bandaged and finally relaxed. Sable sat by the window again, head resting on his paws, watching the dark beyond the frost-lined glass. Carter kept glancing at the front door. The unease hadn't left him since they returned. That place, the container, it hadn't just been a kennel, it had been a system. Someone had been running a business, and if Carter had stumbled into it, so had Sable. He crouched beside the dog, running his hand along the fur between Sable's ears. "You came from there, didn't you?" Sable didn't move. Carter looked toward the door again, then locked every window, drew every curtain. Upstairs, the old printer whirred to life. He froze. He hadn't touched it in weeks. It was just past 3 a.m. when Sable began to growl. Carter Hale sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering in the darkness. He wasn't a light sleeper. He hadn't been since Claire passed. But Sable's voice had become something of a barometer for safety. and tonight it rolled out low and guttural, like a warning rising from deep inside the earth. Carter threw on his coat over his flannel pajamas and crept down the stairs. The house was silent, save for the mechanical hum of the heater and the sharp ticks of Sable's claws on the wooden floor. The shepherd stood rigid by the front window, his body pointed toward the fence that separated Carter's backyard from the alley behind it. His ears were up, tail lowered, hackles raised in a perfect arc of instinct and threat. Lark whimpered softly from her blanket pile, but Sable didn't flinch. Carter approached slowly and pulled the curtain aside. At first there was nothing, just wind and shadows. Then he saw it. The faintest flicker of movement near the tool shed, something too tall to be a raccoon, too quiet to be a neighbor. A man. Dark figure, motionless, watching. Carter reached for the security monitor mounted to the hallway wall. The feed was gone. Static. He toggled through the cameras. Garage, back fence, porch. All of them offline. He muttered a curse and turned back to Sable, who was now pressed against the door, nose to the bottom seam. Grabbing his phone, Carter dialed the only number he could trust. Ron Vega answered after 2 rings. "Someone's outside," Carter said, voice low, "and all my cameras are down." Ron didn't hesitate. "Get the lights on. Stay inside. I'll be there in 15. Carter turned every bulb in the house on, flooding the windows with yellow light. He didn't dare step outside, not without knowing if the man was still out there. Sable paced the hallway, growling low every time a board creaked or the wind pressed against the siding. When Ron arrived, his presence was like a steel gate slamming shut. The detective moved with a predator's calm, sweeping the perimeter with his flashlight. He wore a wool coat over a ballistic vest and kept one gloved hand resting on the handle of a sidearm holstered beneath it. His breath fogged in the cold as he knelt near the fence. A small black device lay beside the post, square, unmarked, and familiar to anyone who had worked in surveillance. "Camera scrambler," Ron said, rising. "Short-range jammer, military grade, not the kind of toy you get off the shelf." Carter handed him the binder, the one they'd found in the shipping container. "It's worse than we thought." Ron flipped through the pages again under the porch light, his jaw tightening. "I ran handwriting analysis. It's Burke. No doubt. He's active, and he's close." Inside, Lark lay with her head nestled against Sable's flank, eyes still wide. Carter sat nearby, trying to sketch out what he could remember of the man he'd seen. Tall, broad-shouldered, hooded. But it had been too dark, too fast. The only detail that lingered in his mind was the silence, how the man had stood without moving, like he was listening, or waiting. Elsewhere that same morning, Dr. Evelyn Maynard stood in the operating suite of the Briar Hill Animal Wellness Center, studying the small blinking screen of her microchip reader. Lark lay sedated on the exam table, her chest gently rising and falling under the fleece pad. One chip had already been wiped clean, but the second, wedged deep behind her shoulder blade, was still active. A thin blue line blinked on the screen. Coordinates. Evelyn cross-referenced them with the last known transmission time. "Outskirts of Briar Hill," she whispered. "Forest side, 15 hours ago." She immediately pulled up her GIS map and overlaid the tracker data. The signal had come from a clearing just beyond the industrial warehouse lots, near where Carter had found Sable. Her eyes narrowed. That signal came from the same region where 3 other missing dogs had vanished earlier that month. She picked up her phone and dialed the station. "Ron, we have an active transmitter. The location's not far from the container site. We may have another kennel, possibly more victims." "I'll pull a team," Ron replied. "Keep Lark secure. We're moving." Meanwhile, in the far corner of a coffee-stained newsroom, Finn Delaney sat hunched over a borrowed computer, the broken lens from his camera lying beside him like a war relic. He had finally downloaded the footage from the memory card he'd recovered after the chase. It was grainy, dark, but the frame-by-frame review revealed enough. At the edge of the lot, near the container Carter had entered, stood a man in a dark jacket, turned halfway from the camera. His face wasn't clear, but Finn paused the footage on a single frame, a split second when the man glanced toward the light. One eye caught the glare. His jaw, partially visible, was distinct. A jagged scar ran from the base of his chin to the curve of his jawline. Finn stared at it for a long time. Then he pulled open the file marked Burke, Silas Archived. The same scar. Same bone structure. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He began to type, "The Truth Buried in Snow" by Finn Delaney. For weeks, dogs have been disappearing from Briar Hill. Now, evidence points to a former K9 handler named Silas Burke, once sanctioned, now rogue. What began as whispers of abuse has turned into a trail of cages, scars, and bodies hidden beneath the frost. Finn didn't know if anyone at the network would greenlight the story. But he didn't care anymore. Outside, the wind picked up, and clouds dragged across the moon. Carter sat with both dogs sleeping beside him, sketchbook in his lap, but he hadn't drawn a single line in over an hour. His thoughts kept returning to the man at the fence, the feeling of being watched, and the certainty that this wasn't over. Sable lifted his head and stared toward the hallway. Lark stirred, shifting closer into Carter's side. They were no longer alone in the way they had been. They were being hunted, and someone out there knew exactly where to find them. The snow had begun to melt just enough to expose the rot beneath. Patches of gray slush lined the gutters, and the sidewalks of Briar Hill glistened with an ugly wetness, like the city had finally started to sweat out its sickness. Inside an unmarked van crawling along Fairstone Avenue, Carter Hale sat in silence, staring at the trembling form of Sable beside him. The German Shepherd hadn't taken his eyes off the window since they left the precinct. Lark remained at the clinic under Evelyn's supervision, but Sable had refused to stay. Carter didn't question it. Ever since that night with the watcher at the fence, there was a new urgency in the dog's eyes. And when Ron Vega told him about a lead on Silas Burke's old hideout, Sable had paced the doorway, ready to follow. Ron drove the van. He wore a Kevlar vest beneath his thick wool coat and kept his eyes locked forward, jaw clenched. Carter had come to know him as a man who only showed emotion in the way he blinked, less often and slower when something really mattered. In the back seat sat Officer Marla Kent, one of Briar Hill's youngest detectives, late 20s, lean and dark-eyed, with a sharp ponytail and the twitchy energy of someone who drank too much coffee. She hadn't said a word since they left the station, but her hand rested near the taser at her hip, ready. "We're close," Ron said. The building was a 4-story red brick complex with boarded-up windows on the top 2 floors and a single metal door at the back that had been forced open more than once. Evelyn had traced the microchip's last ping to a unit on the 2nd floor. There was no electricity, no running water, no lease. Sable stepped out of the van first, nose raised to the wind. Carter followed, flashlight in one hand, heart in his throat. They entered quietly, boots crunching on broken tile. The hallway smelled of mold and cigarette ash. Peeling paint hung from the ceiling like curled paper. Sable led the way without hesitation, passing the first door, then the second, then stopping at apartment 2C. He growled. Ron signaled Carter and Marla to stand back. Then, with practiced efficiency, he kicked the door open and swept inside. The stench hit them immediately. Urine, feces, something darker. The blinds were drawn shut with duct tape, casting the room in murky shadows. Trash bags lined the walls, and torn leashes lay coiled like snakes across the floor. In the corner, beneath a pile of rags and plastic, something whimpered. Sable bolted forward with a cry that split the room like thunder. It was a dog, barely alive. A German Shepherd, smaller than Sable, older. Gray at the muzzle, ribs showing, legs trembling. One eye swollen shut, the other dull and sunken. Scars ran along its flanks, and a deep gash above its shoulder was caked in dried blood. Sable barked, not a threat, not panic, grief. He nudged the collapsed dog gently with his nose, whining, circling him like a sibling pleading for response. The older dog opened its good eye and gave the faintest of tail wags. "Oh, God," Carter whispered. Ron stepped forward. "He's not going to last long." "We have to get him out," Carter said. "No," Ron said. "We leave everything. Scene has to stay untouched for forensics." Carter looked at the trembling dog again. "Then I'm not leaving." Marla already had her phone out. "Calling animal response now. I'll get them to rush." While they waited, Carter knelt beside the dying shepherd and whispered softly, "You're not alone anymore. He's here. You're not alone." Sable laid down beside his old comrade, resting his head across the other dog's front legs. Ron stepped into the other room, a former kitchen, now just concrete and grime. In a drawer, he found invoices. Dog food bought in bulk. Syringes. a ledger filled with numbers and names. On the last page, a scrawl: too old, too slow, left behind. Later that day, under a pale gray sky, a black SUV rolled into the station parking lot, where a nervous but determined 12-year-old waited by the steps. Elliot Rowan stood in a puffy blue jacket zipped to his chin, his cheeks flushed red from the cold. He had brought something important. A photo taken on his mom's old phone the night he saw the gray van near the alley. It was blurry but clear enough, a plate number, half visible beneath a layer of road salt. Ron met him on the steps. "You did good, Elliot," the detective said, studying the photo. "This might help us track the van's movements." "Will the dogs be okay?" Elliot asked. Ron glanced back at the station. "Some already are, because of you." Meanwhile, across town, in the modest headquarters of KBNR Channel 9, Finn Delaney adjusted the knot of his borrowed tie and smoothed his hair for the 5th time in 5 minutes. He was standing in front of a green screen, camera lights blinding him from all sides. His producer, Sheila Vargas, a stout woman with big glasses and a bigger voice, gave him a thumbs up. "Remember," she said, 10 seconds, lead with emotion, land with fact." Finn nodded. The teleprompter began to scroll. This week, a hidden crisis surfaced beneath Briar Hill's snow. Abandoned dogs, once trained for protection and service, left to die in warehouses and empty lots. But one man's discovery, and one dog's loyalty, may be the key to uncovering a ring that stretches across state lines. Images played behind him: Carter holding Lark, Sable standing guard, blurry footage of Silas near the gray van, the bloodied shepherd on the apartment floor. Finn's voice didn't tremble. Not once. "We've long called dogs man's best friend. But what happens when loyalty is sold and discarded? What happens when wolves are bred in silence?" The broadcast went viral before the night was over. Back at Carter's home, the living room lights were dimmed. Lark lay curled up on the couch, finally asleep, her breathing calm. Sable stood near the window again, staring out at the street as if expecting something, or someone. Carter watched him for a while, then reached for his sketch pad. He drew Sable and the older shepherd together, heads bowed, tails nearly touching, snow swirling around them like falling stars. He titled it "Brothers in the Dark." Outside, the wind had calmed, but the hunt was still on. The snow in Briar Hill was melting at last, revealing the wounds of winter. The cracked sidewalks, the tire-slashed curbs, and the yellowed patches of grass struggling to remember green. But this spring felt different, lighter, not just in the air, but in the silence that followed after. Silas Burke was in custody. His arrest hadn't been dramatic. There was no standoff, no flurry of helicopters or weapons drawn in panic. It had been quiet, eerily so. Ron Vega and Marla Kent found him in a motel room 2 towns over, sitting at a laminate table with his coat still on, as if he'd never fully settled in. The television was playing static. A half-eaten sandwich rested near his elbow. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. When Ron read him the charges, Silas only nodded. Once. The evidence was irrefutable. The ledger from the apartment, the footage from Finn's camera, the matching handwriting, the dogs with scars that told their own stories. But more than that, it was the witnesses, the animals themselves. Evelyn's team had documented over a dozen cases, including 3 registered therapy dogs found chained in separate warehouses, still wearing shredded vests. As the network unraveled, names came forward. Buyers, trainers, associates who thought they'd buried their past under ice and silence. It was over. And somewhere on the quiet edge of the city, Carter Hale stood in his studio, brush in hand, heart steady for the first time in years. The large canvas before him was nearly finished. At its center, 2 German shepherds, one older, strong, standing watch, and one younger, curled against him with her eyes just barely open. Snow swirled around them. Behind them, a house with warm light glowing from the windows. He stepped back and smiled, then reached for the brass tag lying on his desk. He'd had them made the day after Silas's arrest. Sable's was simple, his name etched clean into the surface. The other read, Lark Hale. Adopting them had felt less like a decision and more like a promise kept. Sable now moved through the house like a quiet guardian. He no longer barked at passing cars or flinched at sudden noise. He still kept close to Carter at night, but his eyes had softened, no longer scanning every corner of the room. Lark had become his shadow, growing stronger with each day. She played now, tentative at first, then with the reckless joy of someone who had finally been allowed to be a child. Outside, the grass was waking up. Meanwhile, across town in a converted barn nestled beside the tree line, Evelyn Maynard stood in front of the painted wooden sign that read, "Second Tail, a place to heal." The air smelled of sawdust and disinfectant. Inside the barn were 5 large enclosures, freshly laid with straw and lined with soft bedding. Each had a nameplate: Bruno, Daisy, Flint, Pearl, and Max. Evelyn adjusted her clipboard, watching as a retired Army vet named Charlie Mendoza entered with a gentle gait, using a cane. Charlie was in his mid-60s, Puerto Rican-American, with eyes like melted iron and hands that trembled not from age, but memory. He knelt slowly beside Pearl, a shy retriever missing half an ear, and spoke to her in Spanish. The dog wagged once, then crept closer. Evelyn watched the moment unfold with quiet satisfaction. Beside her, Ron Vega crossed his arms. He no longer wore his badge daily, but he had agreed to serve as the center's legal liaison. Part mentor, part watchdog, part quietly protective older brother. "Wasn't sure if this place would ever stand," he said. Evelyn nodded. "Takes more than a storm to stop something that matters." They both looked out toward the road, where another car was pulling in. This one carrying a woman named Dr. Naomi Keller, a trauma psychologist who would be joining the program as a volunteer. The therapy sessions would begin next week. The barn would soon be full of stories, both the kind that needed healing and the kind that would help others heal. At the Briar Hill Civic Center, the annual Journalism Awards ceremony was underway, and the applause had just begun to die down as a tall, nervous young man stepped up to the microphone. Finn Delaney wore a suit that didn't quite fit him, and his tie was slightly askew, but he held the award plaque in both hands like it was something precious and breakable. The crowd had been generous. Local news rarely got the spotlight, but tonight his report had captured the room. He looked out over the heads of reporters, students, editors, and nodded once. "The story I told this winter wasn't really mine," he began. "It started with a man opening his door to a dying dog. It became a network of cruelty, but also a network of resistance. People who refused to look away. People like Carter Hale, Dr. Maynard, Detective Vega, and Sable, the dog who wouldn't let the past stay buried." He paused, swallowing emotion. "The story I told began with a scratching sound outside a front door," he said softly, "and what we found beyond it changed everything." Applause rose again, stronger this time. That night, as twilight folded across Briar Hill like a wool blanket, Carter sat on his porch with Lark dozing at his feet and Sable stretched out beside the steps. The house was quiet but full, the kind of fullness that didn't need noise. He watched as the wind stirred the trees across the street. He watched as nothing dangerous stirred back. Inside, his next canvas waited. It was blank for now, but his fingers itched with ideas. Maybe a series. Maybe stories of the ones who had been saved, the ones who had stayed. Carter reached down, scratched behind Sable's ear, and said, "Not bad for a stray, huh?" Sable leaned into his touch, and Lark, just waking, blinked her soft golden eyes toward the stars. They were home now, not just safe, chosen. Sometimes, the smallest knock on a door carries the loudest message from heaven. Carter thought he was alone. Sable was left to die. Lark never knew a home, and yet, something divine stitched their broken pieces together. Not with thunder or miracles written in fire, but in silent eyes, shared warmth, and the courage to stand against cruelty. This story is not just about rescuing dogs. It's about rescuing ourselves from apathy, from fear, from forgetting that even the least among us deserve love. Perhaps it was a coincidence, or perhaps it was God's quiet way of reminding us that no life is too forgotten to be found, no soul too lost to be saved. So, if you're watching this, take it as a sign. Maybe you are someone's miracle. Share this story. Leave a comment to show you're part of this change. Subscribe if you believe second chances aren't just for the lucky, but for the loved. And above all, may God bless you, protect those who are still waiting at the doorstep, and guide us to open our hearts before it's too late.